All right, so here we are on Chapter 4, Lesson 2, and we're talking about designing studies, experiments in particular in this lesson. And I want to point out that in the previous work that we've done in this learning target, it was all about survey sampling, remembering that survey does not necessarily have to be that paper thing that you fill out or even online thing that you fill out, but just that it's an observational study. You're gathering data about something. You're not interfering with that, with your subjects in any way. You're just getting information from them. That would be considered a survey, which is a type of observational study. These are experiments. Okay, so how is an experiment different? These are our objectives. We're going to be going through all of these in this, except for the last two in this video. All right, so an observational study then just observes individuals, measures variables of interest. You don't do anything to influence. As a matter of fact, you're doing everything you can not to influence the subjects. An experiment is quite different. In an experiment, you are deliberately trying to impose some treatment. You're trying to make some purposeful change in order to see if that change has an effect on the outcome. So definitely with an experiment, it is a cause and effect activity. You're trying to see, if I do this, what will happen? And that's kind of, the biggest distinction, and it is a huge distinction, not extinction, it's not extinct. The point being, though, that anytime you're reading about these studies, or if you're asked to design a study, pay attention if they're asking you to design an observational study or if they're asking you to design an experiment. In one, you do not want to have any influence on the subjects, and in the other one, you definitely do. So, observational studies, the effect that you have to be able to tell if what you did is what had that effect. Sometimes there's something else going on that may have caused that effect, and that's called confounding. So if you have a really good, well-designed experiment, you take that into account and you try to avoid or prevent confounding. So confounding occurs when you've got two variables, but you can't tell if you've got, and there's still the explanatory variable and the responsory variable, just like we had before, but you can't tell if the responsory variable's change was due to the input variable. So here would be a little example. Let's say I have two pre-AP Algebra 2 classes, and I decide to give them two different kinds of tests. I want to see which kind of tests they perform better on. I've got an online test, and I've got a regular paper pencil test. And so I'm going to give one class the online test. I'm going to give my other class the paper test. Well, as it turns out, one of the class ends up taking the test first thing Monday morning. Well, if they do worse on the test, is it because of the type of test they took, or is it because they're taking it first thing Monday morning? That would be confounding. We have some vocabulary here. What we're doing, the effect that you're causing, is called the treatment. Okay, so in my little story I gave, the treatments would be the types of tests. Okay, paper test versus online test. There can be more than one explanatory variable in an experiment. It is important that the experimenter makes considerations for determining which one of those explanatory variables made the difference, but they can have more than one. The experimental units are the smallest collection of individuals, and keeping in mind again that individuals are not yet necessarily people, but the smallest collection of individuals. So if you are doing these experiments on individual people one at a time, then the individual people one at a time would be your experimental units. If you're doing your experiment on light bulbs, I keep using light bulbs, but light bulbs, and you're doing it by the box of light bulbs, well then the experimental unit would be the box of light bulbs. In my pre-AP Algebra 2 story, my units are by class, so each class would be an experimental unit. Sometimes when they are individual people, the individual people then that are receiving the experiment are called subjects. Interchangeable vocabulary there on that. So you can do a bad job experimenting. One way, by the way, this example is in your book on page 240, and then it's continued on page 241. It's worth reading. It's about SAT course, and they've been offering it with the teacher teaching it, and now the district budget has been cut, and so they're going to just give the online. And so they decide to see if the online is effective, and all they do is they take a class and they give them the SAT online, and then they see how they did on the SAT test. The problem with that is they don't have anything to compare it to. And so that's one thing to look for in a badly done experiment. You need something to compare it to. You need either a control group, or you need a group that's getting a different treatment so that you can compare them to each other. Now, if you can put your subjects in a lab environment where you know exactly what they're doing and everything that's going on with them, then that can be good. But in the case of the SAT test, these were just students in a school, and they took this class and they gave it to them online. Well, it turned out they did really well. But it also turned out that most of them were in upper level classes. They were taking, AP math and English classes. And so it was very unclear as to whether it was that coursework that made them improve their scores, or if it was the online course. So field, we call that a field experiment when you're doing it in the environment of the subject, okay? But if you're bringing them into a lab, which is why many times in high-level experimentation they do that as much as they can, bring them into a lab. So comparison is one of the things that you would look for in a good experiment. Another one would be bias can happen when subjects are not randomly assigned. So for example, in the case of my classes getting the online versus paper test, I just said, well, I'll give one class the online test and one class the paper test. I did not randomly assign anything there. One class meets fourth block in the afternoon, the other, and has 30 students in it. The other class meets first block and has 11 students in it. These are very different groups of kids. I mean, they've had the same background education by and large. They're good students by and large, but still they're meeting at a very different time of day, very different environment. One class is really kind of rambunctious and the other class is extremely quiet. So, there's all kinds of things there. So it would be much better if instead I had taken all of the students, put their names in a hat, and randomly drawn names and assigned them then to online or paper test, and then look to see which one did they do better. So random assignment is a very important part of experimental design. These are the four principles then of experimental design, the four kind of tests that you use to see was this a well-designed experiment? Was there a way to have comparison? Were there at least two or more treatments? Now, one of those treatments might be a control group, which just means that they basically get no treatment, okay? It might be that they get a placebo, if it's a medical thing, like everybody's taking a pill, and they all look alike and they all taste alike. Some of them are actually medications, some of them are not. The thing is that when people take pills, they tend to think, oh, I'm getting better because I'm taking medicine. So if you don't give some of the people a pill, then the other group might look like they're doing really well because people are saying, oh yeah, I'm feeling better, but it's only because they're taking a pill. So you want everybody to have that. But anyway, you want to have this comparison. You want to have two or more treatments. You want those subjects to be randomly assigned. Very important part of the experimental design. You need to control for other variables so that as best as you can, especially in a field experiment. You have to really watch for that. And then replication, as far as when we talk about replication statistics, are basically saying make sure that enough people are receiving the treatments. Make sure you have enough subjects in your experiment to make it valid. If I just gave one kid an online test and one kid a paper test and said, based on that, oh, well, online's better. Obviously, it might just be that person is somebody that got it better. They understood it better. In a completely randomized design experiment, you've got your experimental units. The experimental units then are randomly assigned to either receive treatment 1 or treatment 2. Again, one of the treatments might just be a control. And then from there they get the treatment, and then you compare. There's always a comparison at the end in a well-designed experiment. So these placebos I talked about before are one of these things that can go wrong. This idea that people, just because they're receiving some treatment, they think they're getting better. They think something's changing. So they give everybody, the people in the control group, everybody receives some kind of treatment. Now, obviously, if this is not an experiment on people, you don't usually have to deal with placebos. Okay, we're talking about people here because we think, and so because of that, there's this placebo effect. In a double-blind experiment, nobody that has contact with the subjects knows who's receiving the placebo and who's receiving the treatment. And they do that because it might be that the person that's interacting with the subject may in some way treat them differently, speak to them differently, interact with them differently, because they know, well, they're not really receiving the treatment. So therefore, that would be a double-blind experiment when neither the people interacting nor the people receiving the treatments know who is getting the actual treatment, who's getting the placebo. Okay. Inference. The deal is, you hope as a researcher that when you do these experiments, that you get these results and you compare them, and it's like one group is way different than the other. That's your hope. You want them to come out very different. You want to be able to say, aha, I can tell that this treatment had this effect because these groups came out so differently. And if that happens, we can say that it is statistically significant. Sorry, this got messed up here. Later in the course, we'll learn tests for determining statistically what is statistically significant. But just so you understand what this phrase means, statistically significant means that the effect was large enough that for it to have happened just by chance, that would be hugely unusual, okay? Now, in the next unit, we will actually be studying probability. And so probability will play heavily into this idea of statistically significance. It does imply causation, and this is a big difference. Before, in the last unit, when we talked about correlation, correlation does not imply causation. It just simply says there seems to be a relationship between the two things. You don't know that one is causing the other. But when you can determine through experiment that something is statistically significant, then it does imply causation. So that's why experimental design is so important. Okay, this is for next time. So we're not going to go to there. And that was it for tonight.